In today's episode, we're going to be focusing on the Bitcoin halving phases, comparing this cycle to the past 2020 and 2016 cycles. So subscribe to the channel for more videos like this in the future. Like this video if you enjoy content like this going forward, and let's dive right into it. So the title is 5 Bitcoin halving phases, but we actually have 4 here. So why is that? We have actually completed the pre-halving downside period where we saw 18% downside in January. And you can see here also in 2020 we saw downside during that period as well. And if you focus here also on 2016, we had downside but actually within the reaccumulation structure. So this was reaccumulation consolidation but still downside within this structure. So that was phase 1, pre-halving downside. We then move on to pre-halving rally. That's phase 2, and that's this light blue phase where we saw new all-time highs in this cycle, unprecedented move from Bitcoin in this cycle, and we tend to see the Bitcoin halving rally begin 60 days before the halving, and it has been the case in 2016, 2020, and very interestingly, we also saw history repeat in that regard. 60 days before the halving is when Bitcoin actually broke out from its pre-halving range right over here into a phenomenal rally. But because we've seen a recent retrace of 18%, that means that the pre-halving rally has slowly transitioned into that last pre-halving retrace. And historically, we tend to see we can actually move into the 2016 chart here. Historically, we tend to see a minus 29% pre-halving retrace going up to 40% in 2016 if you take into account this downside wick. And we'll talk about the 2016-24 cycles in a bit more detail later. But in 2020, 19% pre-halving retrace, and in this cycle, 18%. So if we go to this first chart here, the pre-halving rally, it looks like it's over, isn't it? It looks like we've transitioned away from the pre-halving rally into that pre-halving retrace. And now that we've seen an 18% pullback already in the pre-halving period, remember, we were talking about this pre-halving danger zone, right? Because the pre-halving retrace tends to occur 28 days before the halving to 14 days before the halving. Because in 2020, we saw a pullback 14 days before the halving, and in 2016, we saw a pullback 28 days before the halving. So actually, in this cycle, we saw history repeat from 2016 with a 28-day before the halving pullback. So 2016 history has repeated in the sense that we pulled back 28 days before the halving, just like in 2016, and we pulled back 18%. So 18% is actually similar to the 2020 pre-halving retrace. So we're seeing that Bitcoin in this cycle is borrowing different pieces from different cycles. So to recap, 28 days before the halving is where Bitcoin pulled back in this cycle, but also in 2016. And this pullback was 18% deep, similar to the 2020 depth of almost 20%. So we are clearly transitioning out of the pre-halving rally, which looks to be over. It is very likely complete at this stage. We've transitioned into the last pre-halving retrace phase, which potentially actually saw its bottom. So now is the question, are we transitioning into the reaccumulation phase of the Bitcoin halving cycles? So we've been talking about 5 phases. The pre-halving downside, as we mentioned earlier, is over. The pre-halving rally may very well be over as well. The pre-halving retrace, it might have finished, right? So we're coming down to really this transitionary period between the pre-halving retrace and the reaccumulation period as well. So the goal of a pre-halving retrace is to develop a reaccumulation period. As you can see here, this is the red box. The pre-halving retrace bottoms and then moves sideways. 2020 showed that, and 2016 showed that to us as well. And the bottom of the pre-halving retrace, if you're taking into candle-bodied bottoms here, the pre-halving retrace bottom is the bottom of this reaccumulation range. Of course, you could take into account this downside wick, but sometimes people don't really want to do that for some reason. But nonetheless, if we move to 2020, the bottom of that reaccumulation range is actually a little bit lower than the actual bottom of the reaccumulation range. So there is scope for the bottom of this reaccumulation range to develop, but we'll be talking about that in the next video. Generally speaking, we're talking about the last pre-halving retrace, the last post-halving accumulation period, and it's all in an effort to try and understand this period right over here. We're talking about macro reaccumulation because we tend to always see macro reaccumulation at around the old all-time high regions. This is the old all-time high, and here we see a bit of reaccumulation before breaking out into that first impulsive wave. We saw that in the past here as well. Old all-time high, and then some reaccumulation around that same region a few years later before breaking out to new all-time highs. So we're seeing the same thing here. Old all-time highs here, and just reaccumulation right over here. So the pre-halving retrace and the reaccumulation period are essentially sandwiched into this green circled area. So whatever pullback right now, and these are the two primary investing strategies, whatever pullback we're seeing right now, we need to accumulate Bitcoin because it's one of the final bargain buying opportunities, and we have to, it would be ideal to reaccumulate that in the pre-halving retrace period, but also the second bargain buying opportunity is in the reaccumulation period, where we might be consolidating for a few weeks. So those are the Bitcoin halving phases in a lot of detail, and we can actually talk about these phases, what they precede, because if you focus on these halvings, after the halving is where we see parabolic upside. After the halving in 2020 is where we see parabolic upside, and the same thing is going to be the case as well after this halving as well. But we're just navigating, we're just pulling back a bit, moving sideways a bit, but it's all preparing us for that impulsive wave towards the upside that we tend to see after that green circled reaccumulation period that we're currently in at the moment. So these pre-halving phases are still in progress. They're helping us understand how to navigate price action. The pre-halving rally may very well be over. The last pre-halving retrace is transitioning slowly into this reaccumulation phase. I think we're currently in between these two phases because it's difficult to say if we're still in the, if we've bottomed in the pre-halving retrace, and if we have, then we are starting to consolidate and we are starting to transition into this reaccumulation phase. But in the next video, I'm going to talk to you about, in particular, this reaccumulation phase in a lot of detail. So subscribe to the channel for more videos like this in the future. Like this video if you enjoy content like this going forward. Check out the next video in the top right hand corner, and I'll speak to you in the next one. Speak to you soon.